Welcome, everyone, to the 37th Annual Bartels World Affairs Fellowship Lecture. We're really thrilled to have you with us today to hear this year's distinguished speaker, Professor and Nobel Laureate Amartya Sen. On behalf of Cornell University's President and Provost, as well as the Office of International Affairs, I want to welcome Professor Sen and say how much I'm looking forward to this conversation. I myself am a student and scholar of global political economy, and I've been reading work by Professor Sen for 30 years now. Like so many others, my scholarship was transformed by his revolutionary argument that famine and poverty were generally not due to scarcity or to lack of ability, but rather to a lack of entitlements. Entitlements that flowed from a range of tangible and intangible goods, such as education, political power, and racial or ethnic status. These arguments are now, by and large, common sense, and much of that is due to Amartya Sen's careful work. Before handing this welcome over to Rachel Riedel, I want to acknowledge that we're talking about world affairs during a particularly difficult moment across the globe. Our hearts and our thoughts are with colleagues, friends, and families in international locations, particularly those in South Asia. I know we will have many participants today from that region, and we're here in Ithaca to say that we hope that together we can be part of a global partnership that pushes for the distribution of vaccines and other medical supplies and equipment. These are things to which everyone is entitled, and access is a necessary step to rebuilding our global community. So welcome, everyone, and with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you, Wendy. It is also my distinct pleasure as the director of the Einaudi Center for International Studies to welcome you to this much anticipated annual event, the Bartels World Affairs Fellowship Lecture. I am truly delighted to present Nobel Laureate in Economics, Dr. Amartya Sen, internationally known economist and analyst of freedom, development, and democracy, and the 2021 Henry E. and Nancy Horton Bartels World Affairs Fellow. Thanks to the generosity of Hank and Nancy Bartels, Cornell has welcomed many distinguished Bartels Fellows to our campus. To the Bartels family, we're thankful for everything that you helped to make possible at Cornell, and we're thrilled that you are with us this evening in this virtual world where we're able to share leading scholarship with our Cornell students and nearly 3,000 participants across the globe. More than 30 preeminent thought leaders have served as Bartels Fellows since the program's inception in 1984, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, President of Chile Michelle Bachelet, Luis Arbor, former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and former President of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. We are so pleased that Amartya Sen will join this illustrious group, and it is a particular pleasure to be able to introduce these distinguished campus visitors to Cornell's students and faculty, and we're delighted that Sen has agreed to continue the conversation that we began tonight during a campus visit this next fall. The topic today, attacks on democracy, resonates with a core research priority at the Einaudi Center, democratic resilience. Our center has been and will continue to host a wide variety of conversations on global challenges to democracy, bringing in experts on Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, including the United States. And we are committed to the public values of these conversations, engaging in this crucial moment of global democratic backsliding and championing actors and institutions that help to safeguard democratic responsibilities, freedoms, and liberties. I would also like to highlight the leading role of the South Asia program, internationally recognized for its expertise across the broader region and designated as a national resource center. And I want to thank the program's director, Iftikhar Dadi, and the program manager, Daniel Bass, for their excellent service in bringing us all here together today. To lead our Bartels World Affairs discussion today with Amartya Sen, I would like to introduce and welcome a distinguished member of our faculty, Kaushik Basu, who is the Karl Marx Professor of International Studies, a member of the South Asia Program Advisory Council, a professor of economics in the College of Arts and Sciences, and former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. Dr. Basu, many thanks for facilitating this conversation. And Dr. Sen, a very warm welcome back to Cornell. Thank you for sharing your insights with us and for contributing so greatly to the intellectual life of the Cornell community as this year's Bartels Fellow.
Rachel, thank you very much. Let me briefly introduce Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen is the Lamont University professor and professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard University. Before he moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, he was at Cambridge, UK, where he was Master of Trinity College. He is the author of numerous widely acclaimed books and papers. Wendy referred to his work on famines. My own favorite book, number one among his many books, I actually know all his books very well, is his second book, Collective Choice and Social Welfare, placed somewhere between economics and philosophy. In fact, in the space straddling economics and philosophy, in particular economic theory and moral philosophy, it is reasonable to assert that Amartya Sen is the most prominent thinker in the world today, the number one. There are some big thinkers in the world, economists and philosophers, who did not get any recognition in their lifetimes. This is something that Amartya can't complain about. He has received every conceivable honor from around the world, from the Bharat Ratna, which he got when India's Prime Minister was Vajpayee, the commander of the Legion of Honor from France. I'm not inflicting my French pronunciation on you. Then finally, in 1998, finally is wrong, he's got many other things after that, but in 1998, he got the Nobel Prize in Economics. On a personal note, I should tell you that from the early 1990s, I kept feeling Amartya is going to get the Nobel Prize. Each year, I would take a bet on Sen. Literally in these lotteries that are done, I would put a little bit of my money, and every year I would lose my money. Then in 1998, I gave up and decided it was time to change my forecasting model. And I did not bet on Sen, and again, I lost my money that year. I may add that the person I took the bet on that year was Joseph Stiglitz, who did also get the Nobel Prize a couple of years later, I think in 2001. So my forecasting model is not wrong, but it has a 3-year lag. It comes right with a bit of a lag. Before I hand over the mic to Professor Sen, I should add that my own decision to become an economist was because of him, actually entirely because of him. His absolutely riveting lectures at the London School of Economics is what made me decide that I wanted to be an academic and to be an economist. And I had gone on then to do my PhD with him at LSE. As Robert Solow had once said, Amartya Sen is the conscience of the world. We have him talking to us today on one of the most urgent topics of the world, one of the biggest challenges, democracy. We live in a world where democracy is under attack, with dissent being silenced and with deadly consequences that come out of that silence. The price of this is being paid by ordinary people who are suffering. Images float up to us every day on television. We, the Cornell community and the world, are looking forward to listening to him. Professor Sen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to reconnect with Cornell. I used to be very well connected with it decades ago, and I even had a post here, which brought me regularly here to lecture and participate in campus activities. And I miss those days. So it's really very good for me to be back. And when the pandemic moves away, I'm hoping that I will be able to come in person in the Cornell campus. I look forward to that. I thank very much Wendy and Rachel and Kosik for their kind, welcoming word. And I'm very grateful indeed to be here and to be welcomed here by people with whom I share many interests. The title of the talk is Attacks on Democracy, and I would begin by noting that the disturbing fact about the world today is that authoritarian tendencies have been strikingly on the increase in many countries across the world. In Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, and within the United States of America. I fear I have to include my own country, India, in that unfortunate basket. Democracy, whether in a well-established form or only just being tried out, has often been under severe attack. Now, democracy is a complicated subject. It may not always be easy to check whether it is under attack or not, especially since the undermining of democracy may happen in very subtle ways. And I'll discuss a few cases of that. In contrast, when the disruption is crude and raw, as for example in Burma, in the military coup this past February, or for that matter, in Burma in 1962, when General Ne Win suddenly came to power through a coup d'etat. In those cases, it's easy to observe the harsh treatment of many different features of democracy, from free elections to free speech. Attacks can, however, also be less comprehensive and harder to ascertain, and it is particularly important not to miss their damaging role, which can be strong, notwithstanding their mild appearance. Before proceeding further, we have to seek some clarity on how exactly we understand democracy. A very general understanding of democracy is captured in the characterization in the line of the work of John Stuart Mill as, I quote, government by discussion. These particular words were not actually chosen by Mill, but by Walter Bagehot, the English journalist. These are his words, but following Mill's line, and it was John Stuart Mill who contributed most to make us understand that the democratic decisions emerge from the participation of many in what is much like a conversation between citizens on what is to be done. When the conversation is made to stop, or some participants are forcibly evicted, perhaps through incarceration or through merely silencing their voice, democracy ceases to be as strong. Just as Mill's focus on public discussion has a large coverage. Elections, which is often identified with democracy, are not excluded from its domain. Indeed, an electoral victory can be compared with an agreement on a solution to be chosen. But the elections have to require an atmosphere where people are free to propagate their point of view, to plead their own solutions, and to talk with each other about what should be done. In the absence of it, elections may offer little, and indeed there are many cases where a ruling government has got 100%, and in the good old days, even more than 100% of the votes, and yet we wouldn't call it a democracy. Similarly, a judicial order, which is part of a democracy, can also be seen as a forceful speech, which may emerge from a court, but it is how the court speaks to us that matters there. Furthermore, discussion in the usual relaxant may also be not only involved, but directly involved. The issue about famine and democracy had come up, I think, Rachel mentioned that, and I think Wendy might have too. Consider the fact that though India had famines throughout its long colonial years, beginning right from the beginning of the British Empire, ending right at the end of the British Empire, the terrible phenomena stopped immediately after democracy was established in India, with free speech combined with elections. Why did this happen? It cannot be just through democratic voting, since the interests of minorities don't get privileged treatment in a voting system. Majority rule doesn't respect it. If people tend to vote according to their own personal interests, an election would not have been a strong savior of famine victims, since only a small minority of people, typically around 5% or less, and very rarely more than 10% of the people, actually suffer from a famine. However, a free press and open public discussion make the distress and the dangers faced by the vulnerable poor substantially known and understood by the public at large, destabilizing the standing of a government that allows such a calamity to occur. Even though only a minority, and sometimes a small minority, may actually face the deprivation of a famine, a listening majority, informed by public discussion and a free press, can make a government responsive to the likelihood or the emergence of such a calamity. This can happen either through sympathy, when the government cares, and that can happen, or through the antipathy that would be generated by the government's inaction when the government remains uncaring. Famine victims may be small in number and socially distant from the relatively more affluent public, and so can be victims of other types of calamity in different parts of the society. But listening to public discussion makes policymakers understand what needs to be done. John Stuart Mill's analysis of democracy as governance by discussion helps to identify how the victims in stratified societies may be saved if democracy functions robustly through free press and unrestrained discussion, among other features like voting. Examples of attack, both crude and subtle, on a democracy can be seen plentifully in India today, despite its record of being the first country to adopt democracy in the non-Western world. This is quite a glorious achievement, and yet India's present position on democracy is, I would argue, rather far from that. When India became independent of British rule in 1947, the political leaders of the country spent a lot of time and energy to determine the form that independent India's constitution should take. It had to be a democratic constitution. Through this deliberation, in what was called the Constituent Assembly, the political leaders of the country chose a constitution with strong democratic commitment. From regular elections to free speech, particular features of democracy were given privileged status in rhetoric as well as in constitutional demands. The necessity to treat all citizens' rights similarly to each other was also strongly aired. For a while, most of these features seemed to work well. When there was an attempt in the 1970s by the Indian government under Indira Gandhi's prime ministership to remove certain basic rights of citizens, this was done through the declaration of an emergency. The government accepted the responsibility to go to the polls for vindication and seek support for cutting democratic freedoms as proposed. Since the government was defeated in this election, when these provisions were outlined and a vote was sought, it fell far short of it. Those particular threats to democratic governance went away, at least for the moment. There's something quite interesting in the particular nature of the conditionalities that saved Indian democracy in the 1970s, which are worth reflecting. Consider, at the risk of a little oversimplification, three components of the governance of a country. One, legislation. Two, executive functions being discharged. And three, adjudication. Indian democracy was saved not primarily by the judiciary, which mostly came to terms with the declaration of emergency, and some of us would argue wrongly, even though the need for a public vote was actually aired by some judges, which actually is what happened. The rejection of the emergency demand came with the help of the electorate through the process of selecting members for Indian Parliament, that is the legislature, that is the process of voting. It's that process of voting that defeated the regime which demanded the compromise of these rights, and as a result, the government had to stop doing that. If the popular vote had gone differently, with electoral support being given to the violation of the rights of citizens, it is possible that these rights would indeed have disappeared in the absence of judicial intervention. So in the 1970s, since legislature doesn't have the role of protecting these rights, it's mainly legislating, and then executive has a role and judiciary has a role to supervise. But they were not actually directly involved in the electoral process. There was clearly a systemic weakness here in restraining authoritarianism and in what formerly was democratic governance. And the 1970s was, in some sense, a time when things worked out in a way that was not entirely designed to work that way. If the risk of majoritarian tyranny were potentially present in the 1970s, it has been extensively realized since then, and particularly now. India is now under the control of a political group that is not particularly hesitant to use majoritarian dominance, contrary to the spirit of democracy. This has not been helpful to minority communities, such as Muslims. And you have to remember that Indian Muslims are so numerous that India is one of the largest Muslim countries in the world. Nor, depending on circumstances, it's not fair to Dalits. Dalits are the lowest strata in the caste system, who formerly were called untouchables. Majoritarian tyranny has affected other people as well. The Hindutva-oriented government has, and Hindutva is the term, it means the quality of Hinduism in Sanskrit, and Hindutva-oriented government is a government which makes Hinduism, which is a religion, into a political force and a political route to governing in a particular way. The Hindutva-oriented government has often discriminated between minority communities and the majority of Hindus, and has given the latter group particular rights, that is the Hindus, for example, certain eligibilities for citizenship, not open to others. For example, if you can show that you are under being badly treated in the country outside India where you are, and if you can claim to be a Hindu, then you can actually ask for citizenship of India. This applies to some other religions as well, but it does not apply to Muslims. It's interesting to note here that the attacks on democracy comes, in this case, from the government itself. A central issue in harming democracy through impairing government by discussion is the dependence of equity and democratic justice on the good use of information, or use of good information, and also on being ready to reject politically charged misinformation, which could be plentifully released in favor of a particular cause. We have seen some battles over interpreting information in recent political tussles, including in state elections, which have recently taken place, and that is why some of the recent elections, like in West Bengal or Tamil Nadu or Kerala, were so important, because there were huge propaganda on the other side, in the case of Bengal particularly, arguing that the Bengalis don't have the kind of loyalty to India. Bengali Muslims don't have that, and therefore may not be deserving of citizenship in the same way. This is backed up, of course, by a legislative action that was taken rather rapidly in defining citizenship and nationality. Importance has to be given to the particular circumstances of different groups of people, not only in events such as famine, which have been discussing, but also in dealing with deprivation generally for many other reasons, such as the impact of pandemics, which strongly demand public discussion. In a pandemic of, say, COVID-19, the rich or even the merely affluent, not very rich but well enough, leading a well enough life of affluence, may be primarily concerned about not getting the disease. Many people, I take it, who are in the audience and who may have connection with South Asia, India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, may lead a life which could not be described as being very rich, but you may not be worried about where your next meal is coming from. How would it be afforded? There's an easy survival. In contrast, the poor may also have to worry about earning an income for survival, which may be threatened by the disease, because you lose a job, or by a severe lockdown that prevents the opportunity of getting a job and indeed looking for one. And this happened severely with a 4-hour notice last year, when a lockdown was suddenly imposed with a 4-hour notice. And for migrant workers away from home, there can also be the challenge of getting back home, which was made particularly difficult last year when the Indian government abruptly forced a lockdown which immobilized all forms of rapid transport. The different types of hazards from which different groups suffer all have to be addressed and considered together for the making of good public policy. And this would have been much helped by the working of a participatory democracy, including a free and reliable press, and in particular, the voices of the poor being heard and respected out of that. Attacking democracy from inside can also be firmly linked with strictly political priorities of the government. There have often been attempts to stifle anti-government criticisms, which, strangely enough, have been described in a punitive system that the governance in India has involved, has been described as sedition, providing grounds for arrest and for locking up opposition leaders. Indeed, many people I know well have been locked up through these means. Aside from since a disagreement with the government need not be a rebellion for overthrowing the state or for subverting the nation, on which the diagnosis of sedition surely must depend. Many decades ago, great many years ago, when I was in school in British rule colonial India, many of my relations who were non-violently arguing for and working for India's independence, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and other champions of freedom, were in British Indian jails under what was then described as, quote-unquote, preventive detention, allegedly to stop them from doing anything violent, even though they had not done any such thing. After India's independence, preventive detention, which we hoped would eradicate it altogether, but as a form of incarceration, it was halted for a little while, but then it was reintroduced. Initially, we have to note, by the Congress government in a relatively mild form. That was bad enough. But under the Hindutva-oriented BJP government, now in office, preventive detention has acquired a hugely bigger role, allowing easy arrest and imprisonment of opposition politicians without trial. Indeed, in a recently legislated act, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UAPA for short, the state can unilaterally declare someone to be a terrorist which allows the authorities to arrest this alleged terrorist for incarceration without trial. A number of human rights activists, described as anti-nationals, are thus in jail or in home confinement in this arrangement. Now, being anti-national, when someone is described as anti-national, this can be seen as a big denunciation in most parts of the world, with great philosophical subtleties. But in today's India, being called an anti-national may mean nothing more than the person has made some critical remark of the government in office. The confusion between anti-government and anti-national is typical of autocratic governance. The courts have sometimes been able to stop such abusive practices. They have been successful in some cases, but given the slow movement of the Indian courts, its inability to take on cases, for example, a case of habeas corpus is hanging for years now in front of the Supreme Court without action being taken, violation of habeas corpus. And the differences of opinion within India's large Supreme Court has added to the delay. This has not always been an effective remedy, though potentially it is. One of the most prominent defenders of human rights in the world, Amnesty International, has been forced to leave India as a result of governmental intervention, including closing of its bank account. In attacking democracy from inside, the government of India has often shown an astonishing ignorance of Indian history and the alleged separation of Hindus and Muslims. Indian culture, and I wish I had time to discuss this a bit more, is a joint product of people of different religious faiths, including much Hindu-Muslim collaboration. And this can be seen in different fields, from music and literature to painting, in architecture. And sometimes these are unsuspecting. For example, if you take the Hindu religious classics like the Upanishads, and we ask the question, how did the Upanishads, how were they propagated abroad? Did the Hindus do something about it? And how did this happen? Now, to add to the confusion, if I say, can you think of someone who was responsible for a famous Muslim great building, could have been such a person? The answer may be no, you don't know. But the fact is, the first attempt to translate the Sanskrit classics into Persian, and all the European translation that came, went from Persian to Latin and European modern languages. That was done by the Mughal prince Dara Shikoh, who was in fact the eldest son of Queen Mumtaz. And it is in Queen Mumtaz's memory that the Taj Mahal was built. Now, Taj Mahal should be accepted as a reasonable building, and Mumtaz was a famous woman. Dara Shikoh was a famous woman. He was later killed by his brother. But the important thing is that this initiative came from not only a Muslim, but a Muslim prince, legitimate heir to the throne. and it is his mother's memory that the Taj Mahal was in fact built. So there is an interesting connection between the Hindu Upanishads and the Taj Mahal, to recognize which might horrify the Hindu separatists who want to say Hindus and Muslims have been quite on different paths. Muslims have done nothing other than harm to Hinduism, and their paths, the twain had never met. Led by the Indian government's current ideological priorities, many school textbooks in India are being rewritten now to present a thoroughly revisionist history, reducing or ignoring altogether the contributions of Muslims. Attacking Indian democracy is thus being supplemented by establishing centers of miseducation for providing training for such attacks. While the recent growth of anti-authoritarianism in India is really striking, I'm going to leave India here and note that the world is actually facing a pandemic of autocratic moves at this time, which makes the Indian lapses look less abnormal than they in fact are. The justification for imposing tyranny varies from country to country, and they tend to come with articulation of their necessity, that is, necessity of imposing tyranny for domestic security and flourishing, for the stability of the nation. I spent a lot of time on India, so let me give some examples from other parts of the world. Begin with Philippines, near home in Asia. In the case of the Philippines, the alleged cause for the imposition of tyranny is the need for controlling drug trade. That is, to identify someone who is suspected of trading in drugs and being able to kill that guy off is not a practice of democracy, but behind that is the propaganda that this is the only way of stopping drug trade. Going into Europe, in Hungary, the tyranny may be justified, quote unquote, by the championing of urgency to restrain the flow of immigrants, too many coming in, and you have to stop them in a forcible way. In Poland, the apparent necessity may be that of suppressing homosexual lifestyles, which allegedly goes against the culture of Poland. In Brazil, it may be the alleged need for military intervention to control rampant corruption. In the USA, the attack on the Capitol on the beginning of January had a variety of loudly proclaimed domestic reasons put forward by local extremists. Democracy is being attacked from inside is much more plentiful today than they're being attacked from outside. Leaving out cases of terrorism that are not, they are attempts to disrupt and hurt rather than conquer. While a number of non-democratic countries have recently been attacked from outside, such as Iraq or Yemen, there are relatively few democracies that have had to face big attacks from outside. this was not the way the world was in the old days. For example, in the 1930s, when many democracies collapsed, but the main threat to democracies then came from outside. For example, with Nazi tanks rolling in. But the point I'm trying to make here is that things have changed. In the contemporary world, big attacks on democracies seem typically to be domestic origin. Home may have become the really dangerous place for democracy to flourish now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sen. We will move on to a set of comments we've marshaled some of the best faculty from Cornell, different disciplines. We have 3 comments, and the way we are going to do this is have each one comment. We will give Professor Sen a couple of minutes to respond, to take the argument further, to contest whatever you say. And then we are going to throw it open to questions with students, and anyone can come in. So we are going to start with my colleague from the law school, Bob Hockett, who's the Edward Cornell Professor of Law. Bob, the floor is yours. You've got 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Kushik, and thank you again, Amartya. It's always lovely to have you here. I'll be quick. Amartya is, of course, as we all know, more than an economist. He's also a mathematical logician and a philosopher, and even something of a legal theorist, whether he quite realizes that or not. He is one de facto. Yesterday, in fact, as we were sort of preparing for today, in the conversation came up my old mentor, Michael Dummett, who's a philosophical logician, my old colleague, Bob Summers, a great and distinguished legal theorist, and then a couple of portraits who are right behind Amartya right at this moment, but hopefully he will not tip his laptop to reveal them, but they are W.V.O. Quine on the one hand and John Rawls on the other, which is, I think, quite emblematic of the portfolio of interests and expertises that are Amartya's. So I'm going to try to, very briefly maybe delight Amartya with a quick response to his talk on internal threats to democracy that, believe it or not, involves Kurt Gödel, Bob Summers, the aforementioned W.V.O. Quine, the aforementioned Rawls, and then a little bit of Einstein, Morgenstern, and Alfred Tarski, another great logician, thrown in. So start with a quick anecdote. In 1947, Kurt Gödel was being driven over for his swearing-in ceremony to become an American citizen. Einstein and Morgenstern were driving him over for this ceremony. He was becoming an American because he had fled a duly elected, an actually legally elected, illiberal, anti-democratic regime in Central Europe, right? Essentially imposed by Nazis, who, of course, had gotten into power initially by legally elected means, right? On the way to the ceremony, Gödel announced that he had noticed what he called a flaw in the U.S. Constitution, pursuant to which one could actually legally establish a dictatorship, an illiberal, anti-democratic dictatorship here in the United States. Now, Einstein and Morgenstern were quite alarmed by this discovery, not because they thought that he had actually discovered a serious threat, but because they thought that this might actually get in the way of his successful swearing in as a citizen, that the judge who was to swear him in might decide that he's actually not quite ready for citizenship. People ever since then have sort of speculated as to what precisely Gödel might have spotted, and it's just not known because Morgenstern, who related the anecdote, simply didn't specify it. So it's been referred to ever since as Gödel's loophole, but nobody actually knows the content of the loophole. So I'm going to venture a speculative answer as to what it might be. And it's a speculative answer that is actually quite topical today, not only because of Amartya's talk, but because today is the day that the Facebook tribunal, as it's called, I guess, validated the temporary deplatforming of another illiberal would-be dictator, Donald Trump, from using using that platform. So the loophole I'm going to suggest that he might have had in mind was a particular interpretation of the First Amendment, which regrettably is dominant today, which actually would open the door to the allowing of people like Donald Trump to subvert democracy from within, putatively in the name of democracy itself. This is a misreading of the First Amendment, but it is quite, again, dominant today. And I'm going to suggest a better reading that's not only more consistent with history, but actually is logically more sensible, legally more sensible, and philosophically more sensible. And that's where our friends Bob Summers and John Rawls and W.V.O. Quine will get into the story. I promise it'll be really quick. So here's the basic idea. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, just a couple of years before Goedel's swearing-in ceremony here in the States, Germany, of course, recognized that the illiberal regime that had just been ousted had indeed been democratically elected. So the decision that was made in the founding of the new German Republic and the drafting of the new German Constitution recognized a principle that has since come to be known as Streitbar Demokratie. I'll try to say it in German, Streitbar Demokratie. The idea is a fighting democracy, a democracy that does not have to tolerate the intolerant, a democracy that doesn't have to give a platform to the likes of Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini or Donald Trump or what have you, right? Now, the question that gives rise to, or at least a potential, I think, a pseudo-paradox that gives rise to, was dubbed the paradox of tolerance by another contemporary and another Austro-Hungarian contemporary of Kurt Gödel's. That was, of course, Karl Popper, who Amartya, of course, also knows. And sort of the paradox of tolerance is that are you in some sense being incoherent? Are you hoist with your own petard if you put in place a regime that does not tolerate the intolerant? Because after all, if you're not tolerating the intolerant, aren't you yourself being intolerant in some sense? Now, that some people, believe it or not, take that seriously as an argument for on behalf of a certain absolutist understanding of the U.S. First Amendment, pursuant to which somebody like Donald Trump has an absolute right to say whatever the hell he wants to say, to advocate whatever he wants to advocate, including a violent assault on the U.S. Capitol to prevent Congress from carrying out its constitutional duty to count the votes determined by the Electoral College. Now, that is absolute rubbish, absolute nonsense, and I think there's a good legal reason, a good logical reason, and a good political philosophical reason to say so, and I'll be really quick in laying that out, but these each of these grounds is associated with some friend of Amartya's, some associate of Amartya's. So as far as the law is concerned, there are at least three good reasons, right, to sort of discount that kind of argument. The first comes from the old principles of equity jurisprudence. There's a doctrine known as the clean hands doctrine, sometimes more technically referred to as the doctrine of estoppel. This descends from equity jurisprudence, which, interestingly enough, comes from, of course, English clerics in the day, who were always the chancellors in charge of the courts of equity. They were all actually educated in Thomistic moral philosophy, meaning in turn that they were all educated in a form of Aristotelian moral philosophy. But the basic idea here is that you will not be heard to argue that a right of yours has been offended if you yourself are basically violating the very same right as enjoyed by somebody else. That's a broadly applicable principle of equity jurisprudence that we find used again and again and again throughout various bodies of the law. A second legal principle that's quite familiar is just the very familiar idea of a right to self-defense, right? That if you actually are imperiled by somebody who's going to take your life, and the only way to avoid having your life be taken, or the life of some innocent be taken, or a life of a family member who's innocent be taken, then of course you're not going to be prosecuted for homicide in the act of preventing a homicide by an antecedently homicidal person. And finally, thirdly, there's a constitutional principle that, again, is sort of ignored by First Amendment absolutists these days, but is very much in keeping with what the founders appear to have had in mind, which in turn is something that Amartya himself referenced in the form of Mill's articulation, which is the idea of government by discussion. The First Amendment is there to put in place and to safeguard what we can refer to or think of as a deliberative democracy, a kind of a grand national town hall. It's not some sort of absolute right to any form of expression, including not particularly communicative forms of expression, but but more like cathartic forms of expression. But alas, that's the way the First Amendment is read now. It shouldn't be read that way. If we stop reading it that way, there's actually some chance that we could put in place a strike-bar democracy here, which the Constitution quite arguably safeguards. In other words, we don't have to write a German Constitution of 1945. The one of 1787 already is that Constitution. Logically, it's very easy to articulate a principle of not tolerating the intolerant that is indeed logically coherent. All we have to do, and I guess I'll spare you the details because I'm running out of time, but this is where Quine come in. Oh, Summers came in a moment ago, actually, with those legal arguments, because I wanted to assure Amartya that I actually tried all three of those arguments on or out with Bob Summers, and he officially endorsed all three. So I think we're on good legal theoretic ground here. Logically, the trick here is some of Amartya and Kaushik, of course, will know, and actually Rashana might know this as well. Quine has a particularly clever rendition of the Gödel sentence that figures at the core of the Gödel incompleteness theorems. It's roughly speaking, in quotes, appended to its own quotation, end of quote, yields an unprovable truth, appended to its own quotation, yields an unprovable truth. And that's essentially the Gödel sentence sort of articulated without the device of Gödel numbering and so forth. And you can very quickly and easily show then that basically that logic is logic itself is syntactically or proto-syntactically incompletable. That basically if it's consistent internally, then it is incomplete. And if it is in fact complete, then there are inconsistencies in it. In any event, it's not that difficult to formulate a principle of not tolerating the intolerant that's sort of vaguely, roughly inspired along those lines, especially if you add in an additional sort of refinement that Tarski brought into the sort of the general Gödelian outlook on, let's say, logical matters, of distinguishing between object languages and meta languages. We can even recur to the distinction between, sort of content or semantics on the one hand and form and syntax on the other. But basically all you've got to do is say that you needn't tolerate those who propose substantive intolerance. And note that in articulating what I just articulated, I have not sort of spoken substantively, I've spoken more formally. I've described a characteristic of a certain kind of intolerance that doesn't actually refer to any particular sort of substantive thing that is itself not tolerated. We can then fill in the notion of substantive intolerance by reference to a Bill of Rights, such as we have in the U.S. Constitution and such as we find in other constitutions. Details available to those who are interested, but I would get tedious, I fear, if I tried to, if I took this too far along. Finally, to justify the same point on Rawlsian philosophical grounds, Amartya, of course, will be quite familiar with the section, I think it's section 35 in the TOJ, in the Theory of Justice, on tolerance of the intolerant. And Rawls notes at least two reasons to be sort of skeptical that it would be problematic not to tolerate the intolerance. The first is essentially a version of the clean hands doctrine that I noted before, that those who actually are themselves intolerant don't really have much ground to complain about not being tolerated. Rawls, however, to his credit, notes that that is itself not an affirmative reason not to tolerate the intolerant. It's just an affirmative reason not to listen to their complaints, which is more or less the way the equity jurisprudence here works as well, because we say they will not be heard to complain. But more sort of affirmatively and substantively, Rawls notes that, in the so-called original position behind the veil of ignorance, where people kind of know that they might have convictions or comprehensive views, I'm almost done, Kaushik, I promise. They know that they might have comprehensive views, they just don't know what they are. They would agree to a principle of equal liberty, which is a principle of tolerance. And Rawls's formulation then of how, the circumstances under which you don't tolerate the intolerant is he just says, if the principle of equal liberty itself would be imperiled, or if the continued sort of instantiation or presence or operation of the principle of equal liberty would itself be actually imperiled by allowing the intolerant to spout their intolerance, then we need not tolerate them. So end of story, our sort of punchline is we can go ahead and put in place or recognize a fighting democracy and stamp out certain forms of internal threats to democracy in a manner that's quite consistent with democracy, although, of course, there's always the possibility of abuse of that as well, which I recognize is a danger. Anyway, sorry to go over, and thank you so much again, Amartya.
Very interesting. Time is limited. Amartya, you have the choice of coming in now. We have created a couple of minutes for you, or if you want to push it back to later, you're welcome. Your choice.
Well, let me yield a couple of minutes because what Bob says is so interesting, so exciting, and so energizing, really. And but first of all, I think I agree very much with his analysis. And then I agree with the conclusion also that there is a way consistent within democracy to do this. It's very nostalgic for me to hear Bob, not only because what he says is so interesting, but also Bob Summers, who he mentioned, was a very close friend. And I remember many discussions with him with the same type of issue. Now, there is this question about what transforms. There's one argument which is sometimes given, which may be part of these three somewhere, is that you could advocate this, but once you're elected, you haven't earned the right of imposing that system because you have won, no one stopped you, you had the election, but it does not give you the right to carry out that. So there is a transformation that's taken place. It's a little, when I was young, there used to be a comedian called W.C. Fields, and there's one of his stories where he hurriedly enters into a hotel and then goes to his own, checks in, goes to his own check room, and then goes to the window with the baggage still on his back, and he leans forward and he falls downstairs. Then he comes back, and when he comes back, the checking clerk wants to know where he was going, and he goes on repeating that it is the same man just fallen through the window. So the point is, the same chap who has got permission to plead for it and wins an argument does not have the right to treat it in the same way like the same man of W.C. Field in being able to carry this out. There are lots of things I would like to talk with you about, but I'm so happy that you told us such a cheerful, lovely, and I think very wise story. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm hoping that there'll be lots of scope for follow-up discussions in smaller groups subsequently. But let me now bring in my colleague. I get the impression he's sitting 2-3 doors from me. Marco Battaglini is the Edward Mayer Professor of Economics. Marco.
Oh, thank you. So first of all, as a personal note, let me tell you how excited I am to have this conversation with you. I mean, as an economist and one of the greatest economists of this century, it's really exciting. So my comment / question, I would like to ask you a comment / question and perhaps a mild critique of what you said. And this is my point is the following. So at the beginning of your talk, you highlighted how these authoritarian tendencies are a global phenomenon. And this is certainly true. We have seen it, in the US, South America, in Europe, and in Asia. And of course, it's striking because these are really different political systems in different cultures, in different contexts, and so on and so forth. But of course, there is something that has happened in the last 10, 15 years that has affected all the countries, all the democracies, and is a shock, kind of an exogenous outside shock to the way we discuss, the way civil discourse is conducted, which is basically social media and all the kind of the technology that comes around it. And this has affected the way politicians do campaign and the way we discuss campaign. It also has affected the way we social issues emerge and are solved by democracy. And this seems to be important, seems to me to be an important phenomenon in light of, the government by discussion that you mentioned before, this beautiful definition by Baggio. Because, of course, the way we discuss about things is the way we think about things is also, in the end, then becomes, is concretized, it becomes the political movements. And also, it's related to this crisis from inside of democracy that you discussed, because if we cannot discuss issues, or if we cannot properly understand issues, we're also unable to respond to threats that come from inside. For example, as you cited the case in the 70s in India. So my critique, in some sense, is that, is it really the case? These are often things that may seem like crises from inside democracies are really different reactions to exogenous shocks. In this case, a technological shock, of the way we conduct a public discussion, and through social media. And so then it would be really an attack from outside to some extent. And my question is, if you have thought about this, what should we do? Like, in the sense, should we reform democracy? Should democracy adapt to a different environment where the public discussion is done in a different way? Because, as you said, the democracy, one of the role of democracies, I think you used the term of a constructive role. That is the role of the democracy to form the public opinion. And if the environment changes, then the way we construct the public opinion maybe should also change, and maybe we should think about the way we do it. And maybe there are some lessons for the future for India, for the US, and all over. So,
thank you. So, Professor Sen, back to you.
Yeah. I very much agree with what Marco said just now, and I think we have to rethink it. I haven't got an immediate solution to the problem, but I think the role of shocks, and he particularly mentioned social media in this context, could make a major difference. And a particular case arises when the social media presents a disinformation as opposed to real information. And we are actually struggling with that in most countries, including this one, about a particular type of disinformation being presented with such power that it's very difficult to resist that. So I'm absolutely delighted that Marco raised that question. He won't be surprised to hear that I don't have a solution to the problem, but with him, I agree very much that we have to think about, this is a serious problem, and how to think about it. So I'm delighted and grateful.
I'm taking advantage of tossing in a remark to what Marco was saying. I almost feel that the sort of structure that economists have used, and also a lot of political theorists coming out of hoteling, we need to throw in something about people being able to converse with one another. The voters plays a role. If you can do that, and then if you create greater conversation possibility or smaller conversational possibility, and that is the larger domain from which we get into political economy, there may be some insights to be gained, which is a sort of theoretical research agenda. As you were speaking, I was thinking of this. Let's move over now. We've been to law, been to economics, and philosophy can't be left out. We've got Rachna Kamtekar, professor of philosophy. Rachna.
Okay, thank you so much for that very, very rich and interesting lecture. I think that what I would like to ask you to say a little bit more about is this claim that the attack on democracy is an attack from within. And I'll just explain my question a little bit. So you very beautifully have laid out in this lecture and previously that democracy isn't just a matter of majority rule, but involves also the protection of liberties, respect for legal entitlements. And in this lecture, you emphasized the importance of free and uncensored discussion in the creation of public opinion. So I guess one thing is that I think we probably all agree that these are institutional expressions of a very core idea of democracy as conceiving of citizens as free and equal. And in the way that you have so decisively shown that democracy is crucial for developing countries, despite their allegedly different economic priorities,
I think that same idea that what democracy does is to give institutional expression to citizens regarded as free and equal is very prominent. So you've argued previously that democracy is intrinsically valuable as an exercise of our basic capabilities in a good human life, that it has instrumental value because democratic governments are accountable to people, and then also the free press is something that allows policymakers to know what the needs of people are. And lastly, as Marco mentioned, there's this constructive value of democracy. So we discover through public discussion what our needs are, what needs to be done. And while I have been completely convinced by you, and I think we probably all in this audience have been convinced that these are reasons we should value democracy, I worry that this is not the reason that people do value democracy, at least in India and the country I come from. And perhaps that's because the intrinsic and constructive value of democracy is really only felt in smaller societies, in the case of smaller discussions. And the instrumental value of democracy has to be demonstrated by academic work such as you have done. It isn't felt by people. So when I think about the interests of ordinary people voting in India, it seems that we could, as voters, question the effectiveness of our fulfilling our duty to vote. If we aim to be office holders, we might be attracted to what the holding of office can do to protect ourselves and our families from the predations of others. We can also think of what the holding of office does to enhance our own and our families' relative opportunities. So the political theorist Pratap Mehta has written very eloquently about how the state, rather than the market, has for a long time been seen as the means of economic enhancement, betterment in India. So I guess what I'm asking is, so why is this? And one obvious answer, I'm not sure it's the right one, is that Indian society, and especially the provincial society that gave birth to and nurtured the current regime, the BJP, is deeply hierarchical and is increasingly violent as that hierarchy is challenged. So, we have lynchings that are the result of threats to caste privilege, lynchings of Muslims for allegedly hurting the sensibilities of the majority. And when you contrast this with the secular democratic ideals of the framers of our Constitution or the academics who discuss these things, one of the things that's striking is that we are a very small elite. So I was told that at a recent seminar in New Delhi, a former senior administration official said about the early post-independence years, he was a batch of 1952, he said, it was a very small society then. There were only 1,000 to 2,000 people. That was when the population of India was 400 million. So I think that what we've seen with the rise of the BJP is that for the first time, those who were outside that small society of English-educated elites who all knew each other because they went to the same schools, these people who have been outside of democracy have tasted democratic power for the first time. And their actions, as you've amply demonstrated, have been very anti-democratic. But it seems to me that perhaps one explanation is that the experience that has formed them politically is not the same experience that formed the secular believers in democracy who would be committed to democracy for all the good reasons you have provided us to value it. So I guess I wonder a lot about the characterization of the attack of democracy from inside rather than outside, because it seems that what's happened is that actually the outsiders for a very long time in India have become insiders. And when they're insiders, it's that they're not insiders with the same democratic values as their predecessors in power were. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Professor Sen.
No, really interesting set of ideas there. And we will no doubt come back to that because that's such a general question, a general observation. But I'm not sure whether the transformation involving Hindutva could be seen as broadening the reach. Because in some ways if you think about the real theorists like Golwalkar, Savarkar, and so on, they really didn't come from outside society. They were among the elite within the country already, in the small country, and naturally in a large country too. And if we try to look at things that have happened, for example, in the Bengal election, the only area where the BJP did well, like Jalpaiguri, they had got it from the tribal population, which has been supporting it. Now, they could not be seen as providing any kind of theorizing at this time, and yet they were powerful, certainly, and the people who gave it the numerical strength may not have been the same as the group that provided a kind of argumentative strength to that tradition. So I think what you're doing is to point out the variety of factors that's involved. It includes size, it includes division, it includes who has the ability and the right, accepted right, to present their argument. And I see an analysis about the threat to democracy in taking note of these factors. But, it won't come out as neat as you and I may want to think at the end of the analysis. It may be a complicated subject, but it certainly is the case that the kind of, when I was contrasting internal attacks on democracy and external attack, by external I was thinking not of people in the society who now rise, but external are people coming in, like the German tanks rolling into Denmark or Holland as part of the disruption of democracy that happened in the 1930s. And what I was saying is that that is not happening in that form quite. I mean, there are a few cases, but not that. But what is happening, and therefore it often is missed, is I feel the internal process, those who are in office suddenly narrowing the control and giving themselves more power to put people in prison without, say, trial and without any evidence of their having done any kind of crime. The UFVA will fall under this category. So I think what you have done really is to enrich the arguments I was trying to present and the concerns. In this way, I'm very much in favor of that. So I'm grateful that you have done that, and maybe some more of this will come out when we proceed to have a discussion on all these subjects.
Thank you very much. We've got, I can see from the chat and also emails I'm getting that a large number of people wanting to ask questions. We will run short of time, but there are 3 students in queue right in front. I want to bring them in. Maybe if Professor Sen agrees, we will get all 3 of them to ask their questions in a sequence. I'll bring them in one at a time. And then you respond. And if there's any more time, there are lots of other people. We can take a few more or not. So let's begin with Omisha Manglani, who's here right now with us. She's a senior in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Omisha, just go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Professor Vasu. Professor Sen, my question is that do you think that there is potential to transform so-called democratic institutions in developing countries away from their colonial conceptions? For example, in the context of education and health, across the world, scholars argue that nationalized educational curricula can furthermore exacerbate inequities, especially in indigenous communities.
Can you say a bit more? I mean, give me an example or two.
For example, in India, which is where I'm from, I think that educational curricula, if it's designed on the basis of British conceptions, that English should be the most dominant language and regional languages shouldn't be spoken, it takes away the democratic aspect of these institutions in the first place. So do you think that there is potential that a nationalized set of institutions can truly be democratic?
Yeah. Kaushik, so what's the rule? I listen to 3 questions and then come back.
Yeah, that may be a good idea. So we'll make sure that we've got 3 questions that were in queue. So the next one is Priya Pradhan, who's a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences. Priya, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Basu. Professor Sen, you've already touched on my question briefly in response to Professor Battaglini, but I was hoping to explore this topic a bit more. So my question to you is, what role does the media in all its different forms, from news to social media, play in the communication and influence of democracy? And in particular, do you think that the rise of social media connectivity and activism has been a hindrance or support to democratic ideals?
And now we will bring in Una Jo from, she's a graduate student, a PhD student in government, and actually doing interesting work on the role of memory in international relations, right? So Una, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Basu, and thank you for speaking with us today, Professor Sen. The question I have for you concerns the role of memory in democracy. In recent past, we have seen many populists use mnemonic strategies to legitimize their anti-democratic policies, either by invoking nostalgia for the more glorious past, as in the case of the United States, or the trauma of historical victimization, as in Poland. And the broader cultural conflicts that these populists have fueled also seem to stem from unsettled and competing memories of the past. So my question for you is there a particular way of remembering that would make democracies more resilient to today's populist rhetoric and challenge? Thank you.
Yeah, Amartya, you could go ahead and respond. There are a few more questions. Depending on the time, I will take them in.
Okay. Well, I think beginning with the question about the last one with the memory, I think it's very difficult to think of anything intelligent happening which does not rely in one way or another on memory. And that applies to good things as well as bad things. We would not know how to climb a stair or make coffee if we did not have memory that guides us in that. And at the same time, many of the violences, for example, communal rights, for example, are made real by recollecting past misdeeds of the other side against your side. And that's how you keep them into a kind of fire-ready form. They become the ammunition to be used, triggered by memory. And so memory is such a general thing that I wouldn't like to generalize it, but I think what you are asking is, and pointing out, is that memory is such an important thing that we can't do any analysis of what's going on without bringing memory into the story in a very big way. And with that, I would agree very much. On the question that was asked about, was it Priya about social media? Social media is something like a conversation, normal conversation. They're not terribly different. And just as normal conversation can generate problems as well as help us and aid us, social media have these variety of features as well. My sense is that we have to think about social media as something that expanded the reach of our conversation without changing the basic feature of conversation, which is to inform, to dispute, to misinform, to question, and so on. And we can do that in normal chat. We can do that through the social media, whether it's in Facebook or any other feature. So at one stage, one sense, I would like to say social media expansion is one of the most interesting and important things that happened, and it changed the color of defense as well as attack of democracy. On the other sense, let's say that they're not totally different from what we had, excepting the enormous, almost unexpectedly large expansion of the reach and the power. That undermines the social media being a new phenomenon, but also emphasizes how big that change could in fact be. Now, Amisha had a question which was
colonial education.
The colonial education. Basically, what you're saying is that in some ways, the education in the colonial days were seen as preparation for good governance, or governance that's good in the sense of being good to the people in question. I think there's something in that, undoubtedly, and this feature, which I think of as a Macaulay feature, Macaulay's Minister of Education in 1840s, as to how it would be best to train people who could go and serve the interests of the empire in that period. And I think there are two things I would like to say here, Mr. One is that the need for that kind of expansion, training people such that they can govern better, whether they be administrative officers or judicial officers or engineers like pilots learning a plane and so on. That may have been present in Macaulay's time. We wouldn't expect that to change now. That is, they will have a place in the post-colonial world, no less than it had in the colonial world. I think where there has been a major mistake, mistake is the wrong word, major difference that has not been sometimes detected, and that would be a mistake, is this, that lots of the successes of systems, including democracy, turns on certain role of education. If you take the million phrase I've been using, and if there is a take famine or take leaving, say minority neglect, these are not immediately detected. And if you are running a colonial outside government, you don't want these troublesome features to come out. On the other hand, for a democracy, you do want them to come out in a very sharp way. And what changed when the British left, what made the famines disappear, was because the critical scrutinizing feature of education suddenly became much more important. I mean, you could run a system where you have particular limited arrangement to learn about how to judge what's going on. You know, for example, in the famine, to say that misinformation, that in most countries in the world, famines are going on, people are dying all the time. That's not the way the world can improve itself. Is to stop famines, you need it. I have a book coming called Home in the World, and then there are a couple of chapters there where I discuss the fact during the Second World War, the extraordinary fact that when the British were afraid of not having enough food in the country, since they were not being able to get the food because of German submarines, and the total amount of food available went down. And in that situation, there was a fear of hunger. So then they decided, well, how do the whole issue about entitlement, which someone introducing me, I think, had raised, suddenly came in saying, can't we expand people's ability to command food? And they said, why not? So you had rationing, you had food being distributed at controlled prices. The idea was to prevent an increase of hunger. What happened, in fact, was that undernourishment fell in this period, and severe undernourishment completely disappeared. Why? Because they learned something which wasn't known very much, very clearly earlier, that through making people entitled to a certain amount of food, you make even the very poor, for the first time in their lives, afford to buy food and eat it, because, you know, it not only prevented expansion of hunger, it also made people who are perennially hungry no longer that. And one result of it was that the life expectancy that every decade increases, but increases by 1 year or 2 years, and that applied even to the decade before the rationing and control was introduced. In the decade of the rationing and control, this jumped up by 7 years. And that was learning something, and then its lessons, and that's what the book to some extent is concerned with, that the European welfare state in general, National Health Service in particular, learned on the basis of knowledge and education that became quite standard. London School of Economics distinguished itself from for providing this kind of training, this kind of education, because that was enormously good for social welfare expansion. This is also a time when India was having the Bengal famine, in which 3 million people died. Now, it was very important for the British rulers to make sure that there is no revolt in Calcutta, but not to make sure that people don't die. So the entire program changed, and therefore the education needed change. R.G. Hammond's book called History of Second World War, Food, explains why the need for education dramatically altered in that period. So you're raising a really big question of different types of necessities in education. But it's not the case that the kind of education that was needed in the colonial period would be universally and completely, without discrimination, declared to be obsolete and not needed. That's not the case. There's a need for educational judgment, which is one of the most difficult things in the design of democracy. So thanks, all three of them, for the questions.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've gone over quite a bit, so there are questions. There will be occasion, I'm sure, for breakout discussions among us later on, and hopefully some of the students asking questions, there'll be the opportunity for us to discuss. And if there is something important, we can try to bring Professor Sen into it later on. But for now, thank you very much, Professor Amartya Sen and my colleagues and students from Cornell. The fascinating discussion and a lot for us to talk about. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Flaw.